I want you to pause for a moment and look past the headlines. This is not really a story about Venezuela. It is a story about power, about leverage, about how the modern world is being reordered quietly, decisively, and through energy. I have covered geopolitics for decades, and I can tell you this: when oil becomes conditional, sovereignty becomes negotiable. What the Trump administration has done is place Venezuela in a narrow corridor. On one side, economic collapse within weeks. On the other, survival, but at a price. The message delivered to Caracas was blunt: cut ties with America's adversaries, hand over control of oil flows, and realign your future. No speeches about ideology, no long moral lectures, just terms. If you want to understand how power actually works in 2025, not how we wish it worked, stay with me. Because what happens next will not stay in Venezuela. And to grasp why this moment matters, we first need to understand what problem Washington believes it is solving. Step back for a second and ask the harder question. What exactly is Washington trying to fix here? From the outside, this looks like a negotiation about oil production. But that is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper anxiety, one that has been building in American strategic thinking for years. The United States no longer sees the world as a single, integrated global system. It sees fragments, blocks, spheres of influence hardening again. And in that world, Venezuela is not just a failed state with oil. It is a geopolitical leak. For years, Caracas sold access to China, to Russia, to Iran, to Cuba. Not out of ideology alone, but necessity. Oil was the currency. Influence was the price. Washington tolerated it when global stability seemed assured. That era is over. The Trump administration's position is clear. The Western Hemisphere is no longer neutral ground. It is strategic territory. And Venezuela, sitting on vast oil reserves while hosting America's rivals, became unacceptable. So the problem is not Nicolas Maduro or even Delcy Rodriguez. The problem is alignment. Who controls energy? Who controls cash flow? And who gets locked out? Once you see that, the demands stop sounding extreme. They start sounding inevitable. And that brings us to the deeper roots of how Venezuela ended up here in the first place. To understand this moment, we have to go backward before we can move forward. Venezuela was not always fragile. It was once one of the richest countries in Latin America, powered almost entirely by oil. And that was the beginning of the trap. When oil prices were high, institutions weakened quietly. When prices fell, the system had nothing else to stand on. Over time, oil stopped being a development engine and became a survival mechanism. The state borrowed against future barrels. Politics replaced productivity. And foreign partners were chosen not for efficiency, but for loyalty and leverage. China offered loans backed by oil. Russia offered protection and technology. Iran and Cuba offered security expertise. Each relationship solved a short-term problem while deepening long-term dependence. This is how cycles form. When institutions collapse, countries trade sovereignty for time. Oil becomes collateral. And once that happens, alignment is no longer ideological, it is structural. By the time Washington decided to act, Venezuela was no longer choosing partners. It was locked into them. That history matters because it explains why pressure, not persuasion, became the tool of choice. And that pressure would soon trigger the first real breaking point. The first rupture did not arrive with a speech. It arrived with force. Over the weekend, Nicolas Maduro was removed from power, quietly in rhetoric, loudly in consequence. And almost immediately, the message to the interim government was unmistakable. Time had run out. Venezuela's economy, already hollowed out, was now facing a hard deadline. US officials believed the country could survive only a few more weeks without selling oil. That calculation changed everything. Because when survival is measured in weeks, negotiation becomes submission. At the same moment, Washington revealed it had reached a deal to sell tens of millions of barrels of already extracted Venezuelan oil, but with a twist. The money would not flow freely to Caracas. It would be controlled, managed, dispersed under American supervision. This was not aid, it was leverage institutionalized. And behind it stood something even more powerful than sanctions, a visible military buildup off Venezuela's coast. Not to invade, to signal inevitability. If you are watching closely, you realize this was never a single crisis. It was a demonstration, a message to Caracas and to every rival power watching about who sets the rules when pressure peaks. If this kind of power politics feels uncomfortable, that's the point. Because the real story is not the crisis itself. It's the system that made it possible. What we are witnessing now is not improvisation. It is design. The hidden mechanism at work here is simple and ruthless. Control the choke point and you control the outcome. In Venezuela's case, that choke point is not territory, it is cash flow. By demanding exclusive partnership on oil production and sales, Washington is not just choosing American companies over foreign ones, it is restructuring the entire economic nervous system of the country. Oil revenue is Venezuela's bloodstream. Whoever regulates it regulates the state. Notice how precise the demands are. Cut ties with China, Iran, Russia, and Cuba. Cooperate on counter-narcotics. Release political prisoners. Promise future elections. These are not random conditions. They are sequencing tools. First, remove rival influence. Second, stabilize revenue under supervision. Only then talk about recovery and transition. This is why the administration speaks in phases. Stabilization, recovery, transition. Politics comes last, economics comes first, alignment comes before reform, and here is the uncomfortable truth. This model works, not because it is moral, but because it is systemic. It replaces chaos with hierarchy. But systems like this always generate pressure somewhere else. And that pressure was about to surface again faster, sharper, and closer to ordinary people. The second crisis does not unfold in palaces or press rooms. It unfolds in kitchens, gas lines, and empty pharmacies. As oil negotiations move forward, the Venezuelan economy enters a suspended state. Everything waits on compliance. Wages stall, imports hesitate, credit freezes. The country is no longer collapsing. It is paused mid-air, dependent on external permission to land. This is the paradox of leverage. Pressure stabilizes the system at the top, while uncertainty spreads below. Businesses do not know which rules will survive. Workers do not know which jobs will return. Entire communities live inside a question mark. At the same time, Washington's priorities narrow. U.S. officials tell lawmakers the most urgent goals are not elections or institutions, but cooperation, oil, counter-narcotics, and the removal of foreign adversaries. Democracy becomes a future condition, not a present demand. This creates a second shock, not dramatic, but corrosive. Trust erodes. People sense that decisions shaping their lives are being made far away, in languages they do not speak, in rooms they will never enter. The system tightens, the clock ticks, and the real cost of geopolitical bargaining becomes impossible to ignore. Because eventually, every grand strategy lands on a human being. This is where the story stops being abstract. This is where it reaches you. If you are a Venezuelan parent, the question is no longer about geopolitics. It is about whether the shelves will refill, whether your salary will mean something again, whether this pause leads to recovery or simply a different kind of control. You are told this is temporary. That stabilization comes first. That recovery will follow. That transition is coming. But you live in the present tense. You feel the delay in hospitals, in schools, in the quiet anxiety of waiting. Here is the cruel irony. For the first time in years, the system feels ordered, less chaotic, less arbitrary, and yet less yours. Decisions are clearer, but further away. This is how power reshapes daily life, not with tanks in the streets, but with conditional normalcy. Stability offered, but only if behavior aligns. And many people will accept that bargain, not because they believe in it, but because exhaustion leaves few alternatives. Because what is happening to Venezuelans today is not isolated. It is part of a much larger global recalibration. Zoom out now, because this is no longer just about one country. What Washington is attempting in Venezuela sends a signal far beyond Caracas. It tells Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran that access to resources in the Western Hemisphere is no longer assumed. It must be negotiated and approved. For China, this is a warning about debt for oil diplomacy hitting hard limits. For Russia, it is a reminder that military and energy partnerships can be rolled back without a battlefield. For Iran and Cuba, it signals that peripheral influence can be severed when the economic valve is turned. And for US allies, the message is equally clear. Energy is back at the center of geopolitics, not as a commodity, but as an instrument of alignment. The age of neutral supplies is fading. In its place is a world where supply chains reflect power blocks. This recalibration also reshapes global energy markets. Tens of millions of barrels redirected, US companies prioritized, sanctions reviewed not as punishment, but as bargaining chips. The rules are becoming more transactional, more explicit. What happens in Venezuela becomes a template, not universal, but instructive. And once templates exist, others start preparing for them willingly or not. Which raises the most difficult question of all: where does this road lead? Looking ahead, there are three possible futures, and none of them are simple. The first is the optimistic scenario. Venezuela complies. Foreign adversaries leave. Oil production resumes under US partnership. Sanctions ease. Revenue flows slowly, predictably. Stabilization holds. Recovery follows. Over time, a controlled transition emerges. Elections happen later, under supervision, when the system is no longer fragile. Order precedes freedom. This is the path Washington is designing for. The second is the middle path: partial compliance, delays, quiet resistance. Venezuela cooperates on oil but drags its feet on alignment. Foreign ties thin but never disappear. Sanctions ease unevenly. Growth returns, but slowly. The country survives, but remains constrained, stable, yet dependent, neither sovereign nor collapsed. The third scenario is the darkest. Compliance fractures, pressure intensifies, oil becomes contested, infrastructure deteriorates, external rivals push back through proxies and disruption. Venezuela becomes a pressure point in a larger confrontation, not because it chose to be, but because it sits where power collides. These futures are not predictions, they are structures, outcomes shaped by systems, incentives, and patience. And that brings us to the final insight, what this moment really tells us about the world we are entering. So let me leave you with this. The story of Venezuela is not a morality play. It is a lesson. In the world that is emerging, power no longer announces itself with grand doctrines. It operates through conditions, access, and control of systems that make life function. Oil, once a symbol of independence, has become a lever of alignment. Sovereignty is no longer lost in war alone. It is renegotiated in contracts, sanctions, and phases labeled stabilization and transition. For the United States, Venezuela is a test case, a way to push rival powers out of its hemisphere without firing a shot. For Venezuela, it is a narrow passage between collapse and conditional survival. And for the rest of us, it is a preview, because this model will not stay confined to one country. As globalization fragments, more nations will face similar choices: align and stabilize, resist and endure, or attempt something in between. The question is not whether this system is fair. The question is whether it is becoming normal.